Welcome to our seminar today. Thank you. I know it's a little odd that it's on Friday and that we've had two this week. Our speaker is Dr. Jennifer Epley Sanders. She's a professor of political science in the Department of Social Sciences here at TAMUCC. She is also a co-PI for the Stages program. She agreed to join us this past fall. She received her bachelor's degree in political science from Vassar and her master's and PhD in political science from University of Michigan. And Dr. Epley Sanders' research focuses on using qualitative and quantitative methods to study the meaning and significance of identity in politics in order to facilitate critical thinking, connections, cross-cultural understanding, and productive learning experiences in different contexts, as well as in education. So today, Dr. Epley Sanders is joining us to discuss with you guys the politics of science communication and collaboration. So. I have it up on my computer. So let me share this screen.
I'll also see, well, I'll chat a little bit while I see if I can get my clicker set up. Hi, welcome. Just
Okay.
in time. There's a handout right there. Bye.
And I will give you the mic.
Yeah, that's okay. Or do I need the mic for this?
For online.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. We're just going to set up. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I am very excited to be here, and I am a super fan of working in interdisciplinary teams, multidisciplinary teams, and teams that have stakeholders that are a combination of academic and non-academic stakeholders. I hope today's information will be useful to you now and in the future. The title of my presentation / workshop is The Politics of Science Communication and Collaboration. And so most of the presentation is going to start from and then carry through a particular concept and practice called cultural competence, okay? And there's various definitions and applications of cultural competence. The main definition and scope for today is, quote, cultural competence is the ability of a person to effectively interact, work, and develop meaningful relationships with people of various cultural backgrounds. Cultural background can include the beliefs, customs, and behaviors of people from various groups. And when I talk about cultures in quotation marks, I also include disciplinary cultures, right? Workplace cultures, political environments, etc. Okay, so most people, when they think of culture, they typically automatically default to just ethnicity, right? Religion, something connected to their race, perhaps gender or socioeconomic status, maybe overlap and intersect in certain ways. But this can be expanded more broadly. And a huge component of the politics of science communication and collaboration is that when this piece is missing, typically there's lots of conflicts, right? If folks aren't aware of this thing called culture, right, or cultures plural, and they are not culturally competent, it's not uncommon to have problems of various kinds and degrees. And so what I suggest and recommend is that cultural competence is integrated into all research stages from start to finish. So every communication, every process, every output, right, needs to have this common thread, right? This thing that, the common denominator that's going through each of the stages. And so when this occurs, right, there's actually lots of really cool and effective and efficient opportunities. So when there is, for example, cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural collaboration, we can improve our professional knowledge, we can improve our personal knowledge, as well as our experiences, and we can optimize expertise at the individual level as well as the group level. So in the specific realm of research, for instance, the benefits of cultural competence include, for instance, high quality data collection processes or relevant and respectful data collection processes. You have the opportunity for increased accuracy with data analysis, right? And you have improved research collaborations with your teams and stakeholders as well. On the flip side, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, ignoring cultural competence altogether, or if you apply it incorrectly, can result in possibly harmful research processes and impacts. So for instance, research data could have the chance of being biased, incomplete, or inaccurate. This is why, for example, we have things like the Institutional Review Board that exists to protect human subjects in research projects, for instance. And additionally, ignoring cultural competence or applying it incorrectly can reduce the effectiveness and efficiency of team-based work and collaborations. Okay, so let's work through practically what this looks like and what it can mean. So cultural competence vis-a-vis science communication and collaboration involves one or more parties, right, considering multiple identities. And so I'm going to have just a list, right, of identities to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of these identities are going to be impactful in the same kinds of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to micromanage each component of identity. But these are things to consider that we often don't immediately think of as being integrated into research design, methods analysis, or communications afterwards, or teamwork, okay? So example identities to consider include your professional identity as a researcher, as a scholar, an author, or some other professional role that you have, okay? So an example of this is your professional identity comes with certain characteristics, roles, responsibilities, rights, privileges, duties, etc., that may differ depending on your specific status. For instance, if you are a graduate student versus a senior professor who is like the head of the dissertation committee, for example, okay? It does not mean that one person automatically needs to be the most in power, the most authority, right? Like that's not what we're saying, but considering those dynamics. So you and the dissertation advisor or senior faculty member could be brilliant, kind, wonderful human beings. At the same time, though, your professional identity, one as a grad student and one as a senior professor / dissertation advisor, kind of puts some constraints on how you can operate or how you should operate, okay? Because you're embedded in a particular type of hierarchical system. Another identity to consider is your personal identity, which is broad here, but examples could include your own personal value system, your own set of ethics, for instance, your preferences, your needs, right? Your passions, what fulfills you, for example, personal characteristics that may or may not be connected to your gender, race, ethnicity, right, age, abilities, etc. Other identities may include like your discipline and or the industry. okay? Because those, again, you are stepping into or a part of a particular discipline or identity that, again, may have a system of constraints and opportunities based on the characteristics that they assign to that particular identity. And in addition, it could also be related to identities, right? Some of these overlap and intersect, of course. Your institution, your employer, your funder, your sponsor, etc. Okay. If we're thinking about research that involves human subjects, right, or there's research that has impacts on humans, you would also probably need to consider the identities of the individuals and communities that are involved, right? So our research doesn't happen in this isolated or single silo, okay? And so it's important to consider that as well when we're thinking about identities for the purposes of science communication and collaboration. Another, which I think people are increasingly becoming familiar with, right, is political actors and the environment in which they are situated, right, and the identities that come along with that. And then last but not least, like a particular audience or set of audiences. Okay, so when we're considering these identities, okay, there are opportunities and possible conflicts to consider that involve the positionality of those identities. So you have these sets of attributes or these identities, if you will, but they are positioned with other identities, right? And other people, other groups, if you will, and possibly other systems, okay? So if you're not already familiar, positionality refers to where one is located in relation to other social or political or economic identities, okay? And the combination of these identities and their intersections can shape how we understand and engage with the world. That includes our knowledges, our perspectives, and teaching practices, for example. Okay. So, what are some concrete ways to understand, examine, and then work, right? Presumably, again, paying attention to positionality. So first and foremost, one set of categories is values, goals, and purposes. So when you're considering identities, whether shared or different, okay, one of the things that focus on, whether it's shared, different, or opposed, is specifically regarding values, goals, and purposes, okay? And so, for instance, a lot of times group work can be difficult because people automatically assume or stereotype that everybody in the group or the team shares the exact set of values, goals, and purposes, right? And that may not be the case, right? And that may not be the case for that particular project, or it may not be the case just broadly in general in professional life or personal life, okay? So questions to consider for yourself and others are these values, goals, and purposes shared, different, or opposed? And is there alignment or is there competition? Because you have to make adjustments in those specific cases, okay? So not only do you have to basically think this through, it's also important to communicate that with the other people that you're working with, or if you're doing science communication, and let's say you're presenting the results of your research, right? If you don't frame it in the values, goals, or purposes of your audience, right? You could again do great work, but they're not going to understand or necessarily care about it, right? Or know why it really matters if they are fundamentally aren't clicking, if you will, on these values, goals, and purposes. Another thing to consider is priorities, okay, which again overlaps a little bit with the values, goals, and purposes. So in teamwork, especially on interdisciplinary teams and teams that combine academics and non-academics, there may be a mismatch at times where one or more stakeholders focuses and prioritizes both processes and outputs, right? They care about the how, and they also care about like the end result, okay? There may be other times where one or more stakeholders in a particular setting, and this includes audiences as well, prioritizes processes over outputs, or they prioritize outputs over the process, okay? And this also matters for timelines, right? And so a quick example of that is oftentimes government deadlines don't align with your regular academic calendar year, right? And so just even that would need people to ask, what do we fast track? What do we slow down? What do we let go of? What do we try to front load or back end, right? And so it's really important to know early on, where possible, who is focusing on what, right? Which is the priority. Now, something to consider about timelines is that priorities can change, okay? So in our current society, right, for instance, many research teams had, let's say, priority X in December of 2024. And those quickly shifted after inauguration 2025, right? With the federal government change, right? Okay, and so it's not that anything necessarily in terms of the stakeholder or the actual priority is absolutely right or wrong. It's just that they shifted for the stakeholders involved. So it's important to understand that the priorities themselves, which are connected to values, goals, and purposes, could actually change. And if you don't ever check in, if you don't communicate, right, hey, like, how is it going? What should we be doing right now? Or there's not monitoring along the way, you might actually accidentally open yourselves up to more conflicts down the road, or inefficiencies, or something's ineffective, okay? In a related way, it's important to consider opportunities and conflicts that involve positionality within and between different systems, structures, and sets of resources, okay? And so I'll bracket that for now, because I know that that'll repeatedly come up in different ways as we move forward. But it does also relate to individual statuses and group statuses. So a quick example of that is folks might accidentally stereotype that all public universities within the state of Texas are only subject to the system or structures or resources, generally speaking, of Texas, not fully understanding that within Texas, for instance, we have various systems like the Texas A&M system. So yes, generally speaking, we have the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which runs a lot of things within the state of Texas, and the Texas State Legislature and the governor can have a lot of influence on universities, for instance. At the same time, your specific university system may have particular policies and or resources that everybody is subject to and need to consider, which may or may not, again, align or compete with your own professional and personal values, goals, and purposes. Okay. So throughout this process of considering positionality, there are different signals and norms to consider. These include both verbal communication styles and nonverbal communication, right? It also involves the mode and format of communications, language or languages plural, as well as tone and both time and timing. Okay, so a quick example of that is there may be different preferred and prioritized modes and formats of communications depending on your discipline or your industry, your institution, who your boss is, or who you're talking to or emailing, for instance. And so I often recommend learning about the culture of, again, that environment, wherever you're situated, to figure out what is deemed the high priority, the optimized or preferred mode and format. So a quick example of that is, let's say you're on a team and it's on an interdisciplinary team. you might have somebody on the team, let's say like myself from political science or another individual who is from public administration. Their preferred mode and format of communications is probably, not 100%, but probably going to be long form formal emails, okay? We, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's how we're trained, right? And that's the norm for us, right? And so we can get a little thrown off guard, if you will, when we're working with others, whether that's from the community or not public administration or not political science, because their emails may be short, easy breezy, informal, right? And that's not what we're used to, and we have to adjust. And so in my case, it actually takes me much longer and much more thinking to do the latter, the informal, easy breezy thing, right? Rather than the long form, formal communication. And it also, if I'm being truthful, makes me a little anxious, right? Partly because we view things with such a legalistic and or bureaucratic and or political perspective that we view email as a literal and figurative digital paper trail of what's what, right? It's almost like a form of keeping track of contracts and relations, if you will, right? So the quick, breezy email where somebody replies, yeah, I figured it out. I'm like, I don't know what that means, right? I was like, I don't have a triplicate copy of this, right? Like, hold on, right? And so it's important to kind of discuss that in advance, but also kind of touch base every so often on a team like that, because again, the mental load, emotional load, or efficiency or effectiveness of that could actually be reduced, right? If we're not aware of that. Another thing is with like tone, for instance, with communications on teams. So in American English, for instance, there are a lot of, I guess, how shall I say this? There are a lot of things that come along with tone of voice that don't come across, if you will, in a text message or an email, or even if you're on a phone call and you can't see the nonverbal expression that matches the tone as well. And so that could potentially lead to conflicts, right? Now, where this may come into play for one's research, right, not just on a team, but let's say you're dealing with human subjects, is your data could be completely skewed if you don't understand the context of the humans that you're researching and you miss out on a bunch of these things, right? So as a brief example of that, I do a lot of one-on-one interviews, and in those processes, I really have to be careful in taking my notes, not just about verbal communication, but the nonverbal signals I'm also getting during those particular interviews. Okay. Another aspect of positionality and identities that comes into play for cultural competence includes accessibility and translations. I won't get into all the details right now for Universal Design for Learning, but I highly recommend it. The link is right there, udlguidelines.cas.org. What Universal Design for Learning refers to in this case are guidelines that offer a set of concrete suggestions. And in this case, they can be applied to any discipline or domain to ensure that all learners can access and participate in meaningful learning opportunities and events. And so it may be the case that when you're designing your research and when you are thinking about all the stages, processes, and outputs, that you may want to actively incorporate components from Universal Design for Learning in this process. In terms of languages, this can happen even within the same language, okay? So when oftentimes we think of foreign language, right? Translating from English to Spanish, let's say, or Spanish to English, okay? What I would contend here is it's not just that. It could also be literal and conceptual translations within English itself, okay? So an example of that is I was playing a game with my 5-year-old. There's a game called Guess Who. You flip up pictures and you ask questions like, is your person wearing a hat? And then the other person answers yes or no, and then they can flip the pictures over. Ultimately, it's a guessing game to see that can the other player pick accurately based off their questions, right? Process of elimination, and move forward. And we get into all kinds of funny discussions because, my child will say, does your person have short hair? I'll be like, how is he conceptualizing short hair, right? As it turned out, my child conceptualized short hair as shoulder length, and I was conceptualizing it as above the ear, right? Which is different, okay? And so if you go back and forth, even within the same language, you may find that you thought you were on the same page, but you're not on the same page necessarily, okay? Another thing to consider with language is the order of translations, whether you do formal versus informal, and political or politicized terminology. Okay. A lot of the work I do is in Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia. And I've noticed over the years on Google Translate how things have changed, right? So for instance, in the national language, Bahasa Indonesia, the word for speed bump, right, like on a road, right, that you go over, right, to slow everybody down, the literal translation is polisi tidur, which translates to sleeping policeman or police officer. Okay. Back in the day, Google Translate would do, they would do a literal translation. So if you typed in speed bump, it would do sleeping policeman, and it did not make sense to anybody. Like if you were just a tourist, you're like, what is this? I don't know what this is spitting out. Fast forward, if you do it now, it just automatically defaults to speed bump. So speed bump, like converted as polisi tidur, but then in English, it just shows up as speed bump. So now, okay, on the one hand, that's more efficient because that's actually what it means. But now you're inefficient because you've lost the beauty of the cultural tailoring, right? And context and the humor that comes along with that type of conceptual translation, right? And this can happen quite a bit in research, and I'll give you a few examples in just a minute. But does that make sense for folks so far? Okay. All right. When it comes to accessibility and translations as well, and we're considering research methods, you may have to do adaptations in terms of who, what, where, when, how, and why. And those may need to be adapted, not just in terms of universal design for learning or for languages, but again, because the thing may not actually be an appropriate or efficient or effective cultural fit. And so with yourself or with your team or your advisors, et cetera, it's important to consider what are we going to adapt, how and why are we going to do that, et cetera. Now with external communications like reporting, for instance, it's also, again, something to consider for cultural competence is what is the format and mode and type and structure, et cetera, of reporting. So one example is the STAR method with metrics, where typically what's presented is the situation, whatever the task and actions that were taking place, and the result, okay? Now, if, for example, you're working with a government entity and their default is the STAR method, and that is not your default, and you have no idea what that is, there's going to be a steep learning curve on that. But you can't automatically assume, it would be a bit audacious and probably you might not get invited again, you going in and just doing it your way, right? Because you're like, my way is the best way, or my way is the way that I know best. And they're like, no, no, no. In certain cases, they might refer to a less than ideal STAR method, but a less than ideal STAR method is better than no method, for instance. And so that would be something that you would need to look into, right? And then that also connects with audience types and the scale or scope of that. And so in many ways, you may have to engage in what's called code switching, right? So code switching is essentially shifting from one linguistic code to another, depending on the social context, the conversational setting, the politics, as well. All right, so when you're doing this, when you're considering all these things from start to finish, specificity is key. So like great scientists, right? We want to know what are the parameters and scope, what's the main goal or purpose, and why does it matter and for whom. If you don't know where to start, or you have, or you have some suspicions that you need to like do some of this work for cultural competence, but you're not really sure, what are the kinds of things you can do? Well, not surprising, you can do a lit review, right? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're in 2025. There's loads of research on this. So in almost any research method setting, there's going to be research for a variety of disciplines and industries to figure out what have the experts already determined are best practices, for instance. You can also do consultations with specialists. So that could be people within your discipline, people with outside of your discipline, for instance, but going to these experts. Now, remember that specialists may not have the same exact level or type of academic credentials that you might have, right, for a particular topic, okay? So I want you to think about it respectfully and appropriately, that different stakeholders, different communities have an understanding of who are specialists within their specific groups, okay? And so, for example, certain subgroups within populations, they may have elders in their community that are considered specialists on a particular given topic. And so it would be important, if you had the opportunity, it would be important to consult with those specialists before proceeding, because you might miss some really important information. A quick example of this is, I often tell my students in classes, never underestimate the power and authority and expertise or areas of specialization of two main groups. One, administrative assistants or secretaries, right? And two, taxi or Uber or Lyft drivers, right? Because these are two sets of groups that we typically don't think of as being experts or highly experiential, have lots of high experiences or specialists in certain things. And they have loads of data that could be valuable and need to be prioritized. The other thing that can be done with cultural competence information and positionality, et cetera, is beta testing or pre-testing, not just with experts or specialists, but also with interviews or focus groups, testing the waters, so to speak, in a contained, hopefully safe and healthy kind of way can be useful. And so in my own research, I give an example where before I left the States to do fieldwork abroad, I was drafting my survey questions that had to go through institutional review board domestically at my university in Michigan, but also had to do a version of an institutional review board, but at the national level in the capital city of Jakarta, Indonesia, right? So I had two sets of audiences, but also was trying to thoughtfully consider my own research topics. And so I was working on religion and politics at the time, and my advisors and my classes and the literature all pointed to using your standard Likert scale, right? Like always true, mostly true, somewhat true, not very true, not at all true, does not apply. And so I put on the slide here an example of what it looks like in English as well as in Indonesian. And the question was, or statement, right, is my religious beliefs greatly influence how I live my life. And this is standard operating procedure in the majority of American-based national surveys, right? So I was following my discipline norm. I was also following American norms. Why? Because I'm a comparativist and I wanted to compare and contrast US data and Indonesian data, right? So I followed my own advice, right, which was do your comprehensive literature review. And I started finding out that this may not be a great fit, right? And so I'm expanding my cultural competence. I start consulting with specialists. I start beta testing and pre-testing this particular survey question. And what ended up happening was I did not have very much variation at all. because one, Likert scales are not typically in one's schema or mindset, if you will, with this particular set of cultural groups. And then two, the nature or content of my question as it related to religion, basically everybody was biased in the direction of reporting always true, right? Like, of course, my religious beliefs in a highly religious society, right, would influence how I live my life, right? And so there wasn't going, and this rinsed and repeated, if you will, for multiple survey questions. And then I had my oh no moment and had to go through lots of drafts. Ultimately, on draft 10, the question is adapted. We code switch. We try to think of the context, right? And instead, first, we add the respectful title of ma'am or sir before anything else, right? And then went into which of the following areas should be regulated by religious values, and then gave people different social, political, and economic domains. And what ends up happening is there's loads of variation. So on the question of like, do you believe in God? It's like 99.9% of people are like, yes. Do you affiliate with a formal religion? Yes, right? You're not getting much variation at all. But then all of a sudden with these types of questions, you start seeing that different groups within the society have different perspectives on whether or not, for instance, religious values should regulate family, right? Whether it should be involved and influential in government or law, for instance. A similar or corollary would be in the US, when you broadly talk with people about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, right? Basically, are you for or against gun control, right? People will divide automatically into one or the other, right? But once you start asking much more specific questions like, do you think ammunition should be available for purchase online across state lines? Now you get lots of variation. If you ask the question of, do you think that teachers in K through 12 system should be carrying weapons in the classroom? Huge variation, right? Do you think that there should be background checks on different subgroups of people? Huge variation, right? And so that's something to consider in terms of both science communication and collaboration. Okay. The next thing that I'll show is a quick 2-minute video from YouTube called Make It Plain. And Audrey will let me know if Zoom people can't hear it.
Hello, I am Alan Brooks LaShore, and I work for a national health philanthropy focused on addressing pervasive risk factors that induce statistically significant health and socioeconomic.
What in the world are pervasive risk factors? Let's try that again.
Health disparities impelled by proximation to extreme inequities in lived experiences encircled by food insecure domains, punitive carceral systems.
Cut. Seriously?
Hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok. Indigent populations, impoverished cohorts, destitute locales. Studio.
Cut. Alan, where are you from?
Cumberland County, New Jersey.
How would you say this to your neighbors in Cumberland County?
I'm Alan. I share stories about communities working to ensure that health is not a privilege but a right. We all have dreams for ourselves and our families, but we don't all have the same opportunities to make those dreams come true. And we're denied these opportunities because of barriers in our way. The good news, people created these barriers. So together, we can tear them down. But first, we need to speak plainly. Using jargon, code words, or fuzzy language, it won't bring us closer together to solve the problems in front of us. In fact, those words push us farther apart. The solution is simple. Want to make a difference? Then make it plain. RWJF, we don't have it all figured out. We don't have all the answers, but we're trying. And we invite you to join us in this effort.
Okay. And so what's interesting is With respect to a lot of the difficult positions and complexities of our current political environment, what I find really interesting right now is that there is a lot of science communication going on right now, and has been for some time, as there's been budget cuts, for instance, in the federal government, right? So in social media, national media, professional sites like LinkedIn, for instance, we have a version of, quote, make it plain, right? Where it's been a long time since we've seen this surge, where you have a surge of people saying, for instance, I lost my job as a national park ranger. Did you know what a national park ranger does? And then listing out concretely, for instance, what they did before losing their job. I saw a post about what an epidemic intelligence officer does, right? All three of those words together don't make sense to most people, right? They're like, what is this, right? And so what was really interesting was, fast forward, I started seeing posts saying, oh, that person is a CDC disease detective, right? And just that quick switch, right, that translation resonated with many more people. And then that particular post went viral because they were like, oh, that's what that means. And so it's not that people default to immediately dismissing or devaluing science or scientists, right? It's just that they may not have a full understanding of exactly what it is that that person does and what they're about. Now, when we're communicating our roles and our priorities, our values, and doing our jobs, for instance, right? One thing that I typically recommend is that, oops, let me see. Let advance. Let me advance. Okay.
Hello.
Is avoiding humor where possible, unless you are really, really sure you know what you're doing and who you're dealing with, okay? This applies to sarcasm as well, okay? So sometimes people will try to be funny to ease the stress or tension, which I understand, good intentions, but you might miss the mark, right? And so if, for example, you're a scientist or you're an academic and somebody casually says, oh, what do you do for a living, right, at a social gathering, and you say something like, try my best and drink Red Bull. Anything you say after that could either be completely on point for that person or not, but that all depends on their humor. So I typically don't recommend that, for instance, on Teams, unless you really know the group, or at conferences or other professional settings, or even when you're conveying your scientific results, right, to different audiences, because you don't necessarily have that rapport. And again, they may have different sets of values and their version of what professionalism is about. So I'm not saying don't ever be funny or try to be funny, but just being cautious about that, because again, you really need to be culturally competent for that set of circumstances. Okay, I'm trying to be conscious and aware, conscious about time. So I had planned 2 applied practices, but I think we only have time for 1. So I'm open to whichever one you'd like to practice now. So the first applied practice would be, for instance, what is your 1-minute blurb that describes who you are and what you do professionally? And the idea would be that you would create 3 versions, 1 for your resume or website, 1 for a stakeholder, partner, agency, or funder, and 1 for your grandparent, right? Grandma, grandpa, for example. The other activity would be a project co-development scenario, which is what would be an example where you might have a different value or priority than somebody else on an interdisciplinary team or a team with non-academic members. And then we would work through how you step up or step back. Would you like to do the first one or the second one? Oh, you want to? well, I can have follow-up conversations on the second one. Is there more interest for the first one? Yeah. Does anybody say online or the second one? You want to do the second one? Okay, so I see more hands for 2. Okay, we'll do 2. Okay. But as a side note, even if you don't get it, we don't do it today, I do recommend that you do it on your own. Okay, so take some time and then where possible, have it peer reviewed, right? Like have it peer reviewed by another person or group. Okay, so for the project co-development scenario, what I want you to think about, and you can either do it on your own or you can chat with others about it, is what is an example where you could have a significantly different value or priority for processes and or outputs than somebody else on the team? And then how might you step up or step back? In this context, I think it's helpful to distinguish between working with somebody and working for somebody. Because in a project, even though you may be co-developing it, there could be actually a hierarchy or the dynamic of the relationship that's required as you're actually working for, and you're not necessarily automatically equal in this process. Okay, so I'll give you all a few minutes to. And if you're online and want to drop anything into the comments, you are more than welcome to do so. Okay, let's get together on this. Was there any comments by any chance on Zoom? No? Okay, great. Okay, all right. So what were some ideas that you all had? Like we'll start here. What would be an example of a very different value or priority?
Research.
Okay.
Where trying to develop a process to detect something in the atmosphere.
Okay.
A state national weather service.
Okay.
I don't really care about the steps that I'm taking to get there, which is what I'm concerned.
Yeah,
about.
you're like, am I doing this right? Yeah, you're like, am I doing this right? Am I doing it with using all the scientific methods appropriately, correctly, et cetera, right? And they're like, when is it going to be done? and what's the big deal, right? Okay, so when you were talking with them on your team, how might you step up or step back then in that case? Because those can be real frustrating kinds of situations. Yeah.
Actually nail down what they want out of what we're saying.
Yes, so I think that's really important where possible to establish that early on. Like, what do you really want? And you may have to, it may not happen in the first 10, 20 minutes. They might not know exactly what they want. So you may end up in a strange way, almost interviewing them, right? In a way to kind of elicit that information from them. But then I would also suggest checking in, right? Because again, as they get more information, they may actually pivot on what they thought they wanted versus like now what they really think that they need or want, right? So it could start off with, we want a particular result. And then as you're going along, they're like, actually, what really we need to prioritize is that this date. Like, I need it by May 1st, for instance. And you're like, whoa, what just, like, I thought you cared about the result. Now you care about the result and faster? Oh dear, right? And that can also happen in other contexts, is like, oh, you want a particular result and under budget? I thought that was the budget. No, you've just lost 20 grand. Like, now make it work, right? And you're like, but now I have to lop off 8 extra steps. And they're like, we trust you, you're smart, you'll figure it out, right? And you're like, no, I really needed all those extra steps and that funding to do that. And that's the reality of what's happening right now for a lot of projects, for instance. Okay, what was another scenario you had? Okay, great. Sure.
Fish in the bowl and comparing it to completeness species that are similar. And we're collaborating with the flower garden base to get samples and everything there.
Got it.
But I mean, this isn't necessarily their priority, so I kind of think this turn out the way it could be. That they would be interested in just classifying this non-native species as invasive, and they would just want to see how my research would apply to directly like manage their spread or like their level.
That's a perfect example. And we see that a lot in interdisciplinary teams, but also when you're working with community partners or government agencies. They may just want you to say, what is this versus that, right? And that's their priority. And then you're supposed to later be hands off on any of the implications of it, right? They're not necessarily interested in how to manage it or fix it or improve the situation, right? And again, as scientists, that could be potentially frustrating, because you're like, invasive species bad, right? Ecosystem good, get rid of invasive species. And then you're just it's almost like a loose end, right? That you have to manage. Okay, so how would you step up or step back like in that?
Their specific goals, we can kind of like step up in making those connections, but then leave it up to them like what they want to do.
Yeah, and that could especially be the case if you're working for them and it's not just this automatic equal, like working with them, right? Because that could be the case, right? That the thing that you thought was of value, like let's say hypothetically, like especially in stages, right? Like let's say hypothetically, you're like, my value is all about the research. And they could be like, actually, your value really needs to be like you're getting exposure to this kind of job or this kind of work. And it's much more of like a really advanced internship, if you will. And so that's how they're viewing the whole experience. And you're like, no, the science, right? And they're like, no, internship, right? And so then you have to really construct, how am I going to interact, not just with them, but how am I going to manage my own stuff in the process? Okay, so I think Allison posted, right, as an analytical chemist, you prioritize process and raw data quality assurance. Yes, but yes, absolutely. Others might not have the same technical background, for sure, right? And then they might wonder why it's taking so long to collect this data. Oh yeah, I feel you on this, Allison. So you could step up by educating them on the methods component and why the process is highly important. Absolutely, yeah. So in my case, for instance, sometimes people devalue linguistics, right, or understanding language, or even just understanding concepts, because they're like, just use the dictionary definition and use Google Translate. And you're like, no, actually, I need 32 more hours to work on this translation, right? So absolutely. So educating folks on the methods, again, respectfully and professionally, and given their respect to their version of cultural competence, for sure. Okay, I know we're all low on time. I can stay behind with anybody who needs to. I can always follow up on office hours and emails, appointments, etc. And I'll let you get to the next thing because y'all are being very productive on a Friday. Okay, thank you. Best wishes.